Some nations are facing a countdown they might not survive. Countries feel permanent, but history shows they rarely are. Nations rise, empires fall, and borders shift. The land you're on has probably changed hands more times than you realize, and in a few decades it might belong to someone else. Today on the Infographic Show, we're exploring the countries most likely to disappear in the next 50 years, whether due to war, collapse, or vanishing beneath the sea. Number 10. Fiji. This archipelago of 300 islands in the Pacific Ocean is in the process of relocating its towns, and it's not because their residents want a better view. Rather, Fiji has identified 40 of its communities as especially vulnerable to climate change. It's likely there will be more to follow. 2/3 of its people live within 3 miles of the shoreline. 6 towns have already been moved to prevent them from succumbing to rising sea levels. However, as ZME Science mentioned when discussing the ongoing relocations, moving an entire community is far more complex than it sounds. It requires not just logistics, but also money, cultural sensitivity, and long-term planning, something humans always excel at. Fiji's also been hit by increasingly frequent and powerful tropical cyclones, some of them inflicting horrific damage on the country's residents and homes. In 2016, Cyclone Winston tore through the islands, killing 44 people and causing $1.4 billion in damages. Though this would be horrible for any community, but for a country whose entire GDP in 2023 was $5.44 billion, meaning the damage totaled over 1/4 of its entire GDP, it was absolutely devastating. Foreigners might associate Fiji with tropical vacations in paradise and laid-back island culture, but the threat of the country completely disappearing in the future is creating a very different reality for its residents. Researchers Amy D. Likens and Suzanne Kosh led a research group that interviewed 71 indigenous Fijians. They wanted to gauge how they felt about ongoing changes in their environment and developments in the future, and the resulting loss of their traditions and way of life. As the researchers stated, the losses of species and resources reduced their ability to rely on subsistence farming and contributed to significant concern about their ability to continue performing traditional cultural practices. Though relocation was being discussed among islanders, they have strong ties to their ancestral lands. The thought of moving, even if necessary, was causing immense amounts of distress. Unfortunately, they'll probably have to give those ties up, as just a 25-inch rise in sea levels will inundate 6.2% of Fiji buildings. Since higher-end projections of sea level rise by 2100 go as high as 3.2 to 6.5 feet, Fiji is about to lose a lot of land and a lot of its culture and people as they move away. Number 9. Taiwan. According to China, Taiwan already doesn't exist, at least as a separate country. Beijing considers Taiwan part of Chinese territory, a province tied to the mainland since ancient times. The democratic government of Taiwan vocally disagrees with that statement, leading to China accusing Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te of heresy, hostility, and provocation. And the world power has been making big threats to Taiwan's independence for years now. It has been building up the Chinese Navy and amphibian forces for, as many independent military experts believe, an eventual invasion of Taiwan. Why would China even want to invade Taiwan, besides nationalistic claims of reunification? With what China considers their territory, taking Taiwan would tilt the international military balance away from the US and toward China. Taiwan is a critical part of the island chain strategy. This is a group of islands that are allied with the US to block the Chinese mainland from the western Pacific Ocean, so it can't deploy its navy or control trade corridors there. Of course, others have pointed out that as long as Taiwan has the backing of the US and controls the semiconductor market, China will be reluctant to launch an all-out war. But the US is pursuing increasingly isolationist policies as time goes on. Its commitment to protecting Taiwan in the case of a Chinese invasion has always been somewhat unstable and ambiguous. As far as semiconductors are concerned, Taiwan produces 60% of the world's supply and 90% of the most advanced chips, giving it a big ace up its sleeve to hold over potential aggressors. Both US and Taiwanese officials have declared that they would rather the semiconductor industry in Taiwan get destroyed than have it fall into Chinese hands. Imagine a world suddenly unable to produce smartphones, and you could see why this might stop China in its tracks. What would happen to TikTok? But even if an actual armed invasion of Taiwan would range from challenging to disastrous, China doesn't necessarily have to declare war to gradually engulf Taiwan. As the Center for Strategic and International Studies says, China could use gray zone tactics to take the island. The most extreme of those would be a partial naval quarantine of the island, which would fall short of a declaration of war, but still put pressure on Taiwan. Other gray zone tactics include some China is already using, like cyber attacks, airspace incursions, economic coercion, and disinformation campaigns. China might be plotting to just gradually defeat Taiwan's will to remain independent through applying constant pressure and making the outcome of unification seem inevitable. Some Taiwanese business leaders who deal mostly with Chinese mainland markets are already feeling the pressure. Taiwan government data found that 700 Taiwanese companies have invested over $260 billion in mainland China and Hong Kong, and 68 of them have 100% risk exposure to the Chinese market. The Taiwanese government is continuing to pivot investment away towards Southeast Asia, but it may be too little too late. Number 8. United Kingdom. Hear us out. We know you probably didn't expect the UK to be on this list. After all, it is one of the world's leading economies, ranked number 6 globally as of 2025, and political powers. However, we are not predicting a UK collapse in 50 years, but rather a radical reshaping of the country, namely by losing Northern Ireland and Scotland. The UK is made up of 4 countries: England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, with London being the seat of power presiding over all countries. While there have occasionally been calls for independence, nothing has stuck so far, but things are changing. After the Great Recession in 2008, followed by Brexit in 2020, the economic and political future of the UK is looking less and less rosy. Productivity has stalled according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. From 2008 to 2019, British productivity stagnated relative to pre-recession trends, but this was also true for many developed nations. Since 2019, however, it has stalled further, and other countries have begun to leave the UK behind. Then, Brexit increased barriers to trade and decreased investment. In November 2023, Britain's National Institute of Economic and Social Research found that UK business investment could have been about 12.4% higher in 2023 if Brexit did not happen. Now, England is still a well-off country. It's not going to become a low-income nation overnight. The problem isn't that the UK is about to collapse, but rather that the prospect of independence for Scotland or potential reunification with Ireland for Northern Ireland is starting to look better than the alternative. While overall support for Scottish independence is around 45% now, younger Scottish voters are much more pro-independence. According to YouGov data, 39% of 16 to 24-year-olds support independence, while 31% oppose it, but 42% of 25 to 49-year-olds support independence, as opposed to 37% who oppose it. A Norstat poll in the Sunday Times found that among likely voters, 67% of those between the ages of 16 and 34 would vote for independence. Even more importantly, those who support independence hold much stronger views than those who want to stay in the UK. 1 in 5 Remain voters say their view isn't that strong, while only 8% of those supporting independence say theirs isn't. Next door, Ireland's economy has been booming. In terms of 5 years average GDP growth, the UK ranks 126th worldwide, while Ireland ranks first. An influx of multinational corporations has created huge job opportunities for people on the Emerald Isle. And Northern Ireland, which was once comfortably richer than its southern neighbor, has fallen behind the Republic of Ireland. What is more, the Good Friday Agreement that ended the Irish Troubles clearly allows for a potential referendum to reunify Ireland. As more independence-minded young Scottish and Northern Irish voters grow up, and the economy struggles, the possibility of the United Kingdom of England and Wales seems ever more likely by the end of the century. Number 7. Vanuatu. In 2023, the country of Vanuatu was hit by Tropical Cyclone Kevin. Despite the ordinary name, it was a Category 4 storm that brought 143-mile-per-hour winds to the capital of Port Vila. This was after the capital had been battered by Cyclone Judy, which had caused extensive flooding. Understandably, the capital was left in a horrifically destroyed state. Vanuatu's National Disaster Management Office estimated that 80% of the 320,000 population had been affected, losing either their houses or access to power, clean water, telecommunications, or for some especially unlucky residents, all 4. As usual, the poorest residents were the hardest hit. The most vulnerable are those living in impromptu housing. They're the ones who lost their houses and had their belongings destroyed, said local journalist Dan McGarry. Considering that Vanuatu is a pretty poor country, with a GNI per capita of just over $3,800 as of 2023, this doesn't bode well for its residents' future in an era of increasing flooding and rising sea levels. After the twin cyclones hit, a lot of the residents whose makeshift homes were destroyed were left out on the street with no shelter, no food, and an increasingly threatened source of income. Around 80% of Vanuatu make their living off subsistence agriculture, particularly relying on the crops of yams, taro, and sweet potato. Increasing sea levels are causing not only the salinization of local water, the invasion of seawater into farmland is also destroying large swaths of crops that the locals rely on not only for income but survival. And things aren't looking good for the nation, as the sea levels around Vanuatu are actually rising faster than the global average, an average of 0.2 inches per year since 1993. Climate change destroying people's livelihoods, agriculture, and flooding the land might make Vanuatu cease to exist entirely as a country. Number 6. Yemen. Since 2014, Yemen has been embroiled in an ongoing civil war between Shiite rebels known as the Houthis, backed by Iran, and the country's Sunni government, who are allied with Saudi Arabia. And there is no end in sight. More than a decade ago, the Houthis took over the country's capital of Sana'a and demanded that the government lower fuel prices and then resign. When President Abdurabu Mansur Hadi rejected the request, armed Houthis seized his palace and asked him again, politely. This caused retaliation by neighboring Saudi Arabia, which inflicted economic isolation as well as military strikes on the Houthi rebels with U.S. support. And since then, the situation has spiraled. According to the United Nations, 20 million people of Yemen's 40 million population need aid to survive. 5 million people have been internally displaced by ongoing violence and the resulting destruction and poverty. The nation faces a huge risk of large-scale famine in the imminent future on top of its ongoing humanitarian crisis. And as if this wasn't bad enough, Yemen also finds itself in a water crisis to round out its crisis bingo card. As a pretty dry country, it only gets between 4 and 4.4 inches of rain a year at the best of times, not nearly enough to support its population, and by now a lot of the country's water infrastructure has been contaminated or outright destroyed by the ongoing violence. And the government isn't exactly in a position to help anything, distracted as they are with fighting a rebel group and dealing with hostile powers in the region. And that means as of 2025, Yemen has one of the lowest per capita water availability rates in the world, with just under 5,300 cubic feet per year of water. To give you an idea of how bad that is, in the Middle East and North Africa at large, the average water availability is around 44,100 cubic feet per year. Ongoing war, famine, droughts, and a completely non-functional government put Yemen in deep peril of ceasing to exist entirely in 50 years, at least in its current form. Number 5. South Sudan. The world's newest country may also be its most likely to collapse. South Sudan broke away from Sudan on July 9, 2011, after an ongoing violent conflict between forces in the north and the south. This was due to Christian and animist populations in the south wanting freedom from the mostly Arab, Muslim-dominated government in Khartoum that actively persecuted them. But new countries are notoriously unstable, and new countries forged as a result of violence, war, and mired in poverty are even worse off. Perhaps that's why only 2 years into its founding, South Sudan experienced its first ever civil war, which lasted 5 years from 2013 to 2020. This violence lay on top of the 2 brutal civil wars that had engulfed Sudanese society from 1955 to 1972 and then from 1983 to 2005. It was a nation with deep social, economic, and cultural scars that did not go away. They also resulted in an insanely enlarged military sector, which, propped up by large oil revenues after 2005, absorbed a bunch of militias and rebel groups. They became even bigger and more formidable, but also more fractured, chaotic, and disorganized. That's led to huge problems for its President Kiir of SPLM, or the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, who has had to keep switching alliances for the survival of his government. And now that the civil war in Sudan has spilled over into South Sudan, it's caused a whole host of other problems. Since February 2025, the government's military has been fighting the White Army militia in the Upper Nile area. It's also been fighting the SPLM-AIO, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement Army, in opposition, a splinter group that broke off in 2013. Kiir has also allied himself with Sudan's SAF, Sudan Armed Forces, in the civil war to protect himself and prevent Sudan from providing support to the SPLM-AIO. But now, a new development has caused him to switch support to the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF. Keep up now. Which has now caused the SAF to support his opponents. That's a lot of groups and fighting for a new government to deal with all at once. Oh, and what caused the change in the alliance? Well, due to the current war in Sudan, the oil pipeline South Sudan uses to push out exports was damaged and cut off. This dealt a severe financial blow to the country on top of its array of conflicts. so South Sudan's future is looking shaky to say the least. Number 4. Kiribati. Kiribati is smack dab in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, a terrible place to be when your land is slowly going underwater. Unfortunately, and what is a recurring theme on this list, this 120,000-person island nation has an average elevation of 6 feet above sea level. So a sea level rise to 3 feet would make it lose a full 2/3 of its current land. And the problems for Kiribati won't start with the sea levels covering the islands. By the end of the 21st century, climate scientists predict that all of the chain's far-flung islands, spanning an area larger than that of the contiguous U.S., will experience more than 100 days of flooding a year. Kiribati's actually already lost islands due to rising sea levels. In 1999, the islands of Vanuatu and Tabua Tarawa were flooded and are now permanently underwater. Thankfully, they weren't populated, but they were still used by fishermen out for work. And now, well, clearly they can't be used as a rest stop anymore. The country has 33 islands remaining in its atoll, at least as of the release of this video, 20 of them inhabited, and the threat of rising sea levels shows no signs of subsiding. Former President Anote Tong, recognizing the problem of keeping his country alive in the future, purchased 6,000 acres of Fiji, which, as you've already seen on this list, is not the safest bet to counter climate change, for a possible refuge for Kiribati's inhabitants. And at some point, they were even in talks with a Japanese engineering firm to build a floating island that could house the country's inhabitants. To make matters worse, half of Kiribati's population live in South Tarawa, meaning if the capital goes underwater, the country is pretty much done. Number 3. Ethiopia. Multiple observers and experts, both in East Africa and the West, believe that Ethiopia is about to balkanize. In other words, break off into separate, smaller regions like the former Yugoslavia. The only question for them is how violently or peacefully will it happen. Between 2020 and 2022, war engulfed Ethiopia as the government fought militants from the region of Tigray, which was controlled by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, or TPLF. Though the war technically ended in November 2022, the damage it caused to not only the country and people's lives, but the very fabric of Ethiopian society is inconceivable. During the war, around 600,000 people were killed, with war crimes regularly going unacknowledged and unpunished, and Amhara communities being persecuted. As of 2024, Ethiopia still has 3.3 million internally displaced people, according to the International Organization for Migration. The rest of the world reacted by, well, doing nothing much at all, honestly, with other conflicts gaining much more attention than the violence in Ethiopia. Meanwhile, the civil war left Tigray almost totally destroyed, and the capital of the region was handed over to the federal government, exacerbating tensions with the local population. In 2024, people in the regions of Oromia and Amhara also rebelled against the federal government, with Amhara's Fano militia and Oromia's OLA group fighting the government simultaneously. Since insurgencies seemed to be going around, Tigray went ahead and erupted in conflict once again, leading to the Ethiopian government losing control in the province. To make things even worse, if such a thing is possible, Ethiopia also ticked off Eritrea, a country it has a lot of hostilities with anyway. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said he wanted access to a Red Sea port, an indirect threat to Eritrea, which is the strip of land currently preventing Ethiopia from getting to the Red Sea. Ethiopia also agreed to recognize the independence of the breakaway Republic of Somaliland, which annoyed their other neighbor, Somalia. In other words, the Ethiopian government isn't making many friends right now, at home or abroad, and it's unlikely Ethiopia can handle tensions and potential conflict with several neighbors while also managing several breakaway regions of its own. According to German international broadcaster DW, if there is not a serious national dialogue involving all relevant powers, it will be difficult to halt the balkanization of Ethiopia, in which several of the rebellious states will break away and form their own countries. And considering how many politicians and leaders nowadays are willing to have serious national dialogues, we're gonna bet on balkanization. Number 2. Haiti. Haiti is on the list of countries most vulnerable to climate change in Latin America due to its susceptibility to hurricanes, floods, and droughts. But most of its citizens barely care about that reality because they're living with a much more urgent and horrifying one. Living in Haiti currently has become something akin to surviving hell. Gangs control large parts of the capital, 80% of Port-au-Prince, according to the United Nations, as well as the rest of the country. The government has been unstable for a long time due to widespread corruption, poverty, and hunger. Politicians frequently use the country's gangs as tools to intimidate opponents and collect votes. Of course, the problem started way before modern times. The French army violently forced the Haitian government 20 years after independence to go into debt with France for 150 million francs as compensation for becoming independent and free slaves. The debt was about 10 times the country's budget at the time and dragged Haiti down well into the 20th century. The New York Times estimated that the damage this caused to Haiti's government would need between $21 and $115 billion in order to be repaired in today's money, 1.5 and 8 times the size of Haiti's economy in 2020. On January 12, 2010, a massive 7.0 magnitude earthquake struck Haiti, killing 220,000 people and causing $7.8 billion in damages, or 120% of the country's 2009 GDP. Haiti has never been able to recover, dealing with a humanitarian emergency since then that never goes away. Then in 2021, democratically elected President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated by Colombian hitmen on the order of Joseph Félix Moïse, a former Justice Ministry official. Prime Minister Ariel Henry temporarily assumed power but then failed to call for elections several times. This led to increased protests and gangs assuming power and running wild, as Henry was left stranded in Puerto Rico for most of his de facto presidency. Today, gangs have taken over the country's ports and airports, not even allowing the delivery of aid and other supplies to an increasingly starving population. Of the country's 11.6 million person population, the UN World Food Program estimates that 5.7 million, or almost half of the country, faces food insecurity as of April 2025. Of that group, 2 million are projected to face emergency-level hunger. Not to mention the country currently has no president, just a transitional council to organize elections that has completely failed to do so for 4 years now. Couple that with ports and airports controlled by gangs, 1 million internally displaced people, and a record 5,600 murders in 2024 alone, translating to a homicide rate of 48 per 100,000, otherwise known as way too high, and Haiti's future seems doomed. Number 1. Maldives. If you want to go to this romantic vacation destination, you'd better book your tickets soon, because the Maldives have the bad luck of being the flattest country on the earth. The average elevation there is only 3 feet, otherwise known as little more than half of the average man's height. The Maldives also have the bad luck of being surrounded by the Indian Ocean, and the further problem is that many of the country's islands have an even lower elevation than the average. That means that rising sea levels could cover way more than even the low altitude of the country suggests. After all, 80% of the country's coral islands are less than 3 feet above sea level. The Union of Concerned Scientists, or UCS, studied the effect of probable climate change on the island chain and found that if the sea levels rise by 1.5 feet, 77% of the country's 1,200 islands could find themselves underwater by 2100. And the problem isn't just flooding, but the fact that sources of drinking water would be flooded with salt water, making it unusable, and frequent flooding on the islands left above water. This means a substantial amount of the Maldives' 540,000 population would have to either all gather into one of the few remaining islands, a losing long-term plan as the sea levels would keep rising and eventually flood those as well, or find a new country. And other organizations like the IPCC believe that by 2100 the sea levels could rise by 1.6 to 3 feet instead, making the vast majority of the Maldives uninhabitable. Some countries might disappear in the next 50 years, but others are already nearly impossible to reach. Watch why these countries are almost impossible to visit to find out why, or click on this video instead.